welcome to Leaders in Lending. I'm your host, Jeff Keltner. This week's episode features my conversation with Anna Counselman, the co-founder and head of operations at Upstart. So I've known Anna for a while. I really wanted to have Anna on because Anna was part of the team that left Google to found Upstart, and I think really brings a lot of insight, both from her experience managing very large consumer support and operations on Gmail, for instance, at Google, and the lessons they learned and applied to running operations here at Upstart. In particular, her belief that as opposed to building support around a fixed product, there's a give and take between operations support and the product and engineering process that kind of helps you actually optimize the product, not just build support around it. And it's kind of deeply embedded in the Upstart culture, and is also kind of serves as our head of people and culture. And so we dive a little bit into the way Upstart is moving towards a digital first workplace and the structuring of the company around vertical working teams. It's I think a really interesting and innovative approach to kind of breaking up a big company into smaller units without actually becoming a business unit GM type culture. So a lot of interesting topics, a lot of things I think you can take away about how Upstart is leading the way and is applying lessons from the technology world into the financial services sector. So please enjoy this conversation with Anna Counselman.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm looking forward to this conversation. But I've started asking everybody at the beginning of the podcast to kind of, I don't think any of us grow up dreaming of being in the finance industry, doctor, lawyer, astronaut, whatever it might be.
Yeah.
What was the path that led you to coming into the financial services industry? And then a little bit about, what it is you do here at Upstart.
Yeah, thank you so much. So actually, interestingly, I studied finance and entrepreneurship in college. So in a way, I'm like exactly applying my major.
Right where
Like
you're supposed to
fintech
be.
startup is like exactly according to plan. But of course, it wasn't a straight line by any means. So I've always worked in operations. So I started my career actually in industrial operations, working for a company called McMaster Car, like shaving seconds off of the assembly line and like trying to figure out logistics and things like this. And then I kept trying to do these like cultural initiatives there. And let's just say they were not met with a whole lot of enthusiasm in an industrial supply setting. So when Google hit the scene in 2007 as the best place to work, and I read about their like approach, which at the time was completely revolutionary. Nobody fed their employees, nobody was that transparent, nobody was doing all the things.
Yeah.
It's like, I've got to just find a job there. So I found some role. I was an operations manager who was managing like managers and people underneath them and all this stuff. And I found a job that said that. So I was like, oh, I'll apply to that job. And halfway through my interviews, they were like, this isn't a management role. And I was like, oh,
Just
okay,
as
that's
manager.
fine. But honestly, if they had told me to like sort paper clips, I would have taken the job anyway. So anyway, that's how I got to Google. And then I spent 5 years there managing various operations teams, probably most notably the Gmail operations team as they scaled substantially at that time. And that's how I met Dave. And Dave and I got to work on a couple of really hard Google-wide problems. That's how I got to know him. And so when he started to think about Upstart and this idea of there's got to be a better way to give people access to credit than what's being done today. Before that, I was like, I'm going to retire from Google. I love this place. I'm never leaving here. And sort of after those conversations, I was like, okay, I can't not do this. So quit Google and have been here ever since. And it's coming up on 10 years, which is so crazy. Which you of course know because you've also been here since like the first week.
Yeah.
So
This may not air until our 10th anniversary or something like that.
right,
Close to it.
Yeah, it's crazy. Yeah, and so sorry, my role here is just I'm responsible for our people and operations functions, and then of course miscellaneous founder stuff.
Miscellaneous founder. Yeah, well, we can dive into miscellaneous founder stuff. But
Yeah.
I'd love to understand, like, what does operations mean at Upstart? I feel like, there's the finance company version of operations. I don't think they call it operations at most banks or credit unions. There's the tech version of operations, which I feel like is like the redheaded stepchild that nobody wants to do. Or like, how do you think about the role of operations at Upstart and what you guys are really focused on achieving?
Yeah. So I would say the way that we thought about modeling our operations team is very much in like the tech version of operations. So kind of the way I think operations works at some of the like more established financial institutions is you have products and then you have a support team and they do customer service around like this fixed product that's over here. the way that it's done in a tech company. So as an example, when I was managing the Gmail operations team, Gmail was scaling from 150 to 450 million users, and we had a team of 12 to support them. So when you do operations like that, it's of course not customer service. You can't call me and ask me a question about how to log into your Gmail. It's really all about trying to understand where are the customer pain points, and try to make sure that the solutions to those pain points make it onto the product and engineering roadmap alongside all of the big features that engineers are dreaming up. And so when we started Upstart, that was very much the model I had in mind. So particularly in the early days, like we did everything in house. We processed like every single document by hand, and then we sat in the same room as engineers and like side by side would build this product and figure out how to make it better, make the features better, et cetera. And so obviously the team is much bigger now. We're not all in the same room with engineers, but that ethos of like the job of operate, like really there should be no customer service because all customer issues can and should be fixed in the product. That's the starting point. Now, of course, that doesn't work 100% of the time, but really this idea of how do you, obviously you have to serve your customers, but how do you use those opportunities to really understand how to make your product better, and then get your engineering teams to think creatively about how to solve those problems is really how we think about operations.
What operations? I got to say, I think you're giving all the operations staff PTSD thinking about a 30 million to one. If I did my math right on the Gmail ratio, it's 30 million customers to one support person. That doesn't seem like a good ratio.
Yeah. But if you do it right, if you have the right
Mm.
right online content, if you do the right, Google had another advantage, which we don't unfortunately have at Upstart, which is they just have this fanatical group of super users that just like love the products and want to be on Google groups, like talking about how to improve themselves. We couldn't quite port that over. There's not as many fanatical users of Upstart to support customers, so we have to do some of that work directly.
So
And then,
what are examples of
yeah.
operation, like the things your operations team would do that you've ended up working with product to in some way automate or scale in a different way than by human bodies? I take your answer to mean something like we want to scale the operations staff slower than we scale the business. Like we should be, causing us to have fewer and fewer people per whatever unit of output might be over time by bringing things into product. What are examples of things that have you partner with product to take from the kind of human approach to the more in the product approach?
Yeah. Well, probably the most like notable and illustrative example of this is when we started doing loans, we would verify every document that you submitted. And because we use alternative data, it was actually more documents than you would with a traditional lender. So in addition to your driver's license and your pay stub, we will also ask you to like email us your diploma copy and like these different things. And sort of V1 of improving that customer experience was, okay, customers are sending us the wrong document. Can you get more precise about the document you ask for? So when I need to verify an income, if it, for some people that might mean a pay stub, for another person it might mean tax documents. So let's get really precise in the product on what is needed so there's less back and forth. And we kind of iterated on that front for a little bit. And then we came across this somewhat jarring statistic, which is that for every additional document we asked for, you saw about a 15% drop off, which of course makes sense. And we like to think in first principles at Upstart. So we were like, okay, hold on. Like if you start with a blank sheet of paper, what's the right way for this to work? And so then we got on this journey of like, well, realistically, the starting point should be the customer should provide no additional information. You should be able to verify everything on the back end. So it took us a couple of years to get there, but what we ended up doing is integrating with a whole bunch of third-party services, building a bunch of ML models to predict risk around the verification, we built some other like secret custom stuff ourselves in the process. Like we bought data, built our own databases, found a way to verify employment by email, like all kinds of things. And sort of, it was probably a couple of year journey of like working really closely with operations and product, but now we're 70% of the loans that we originate are fully automated, which means you just fill out the form and then we do everything on the back end, and then it's thank you, the money will be in your bank account the next day. Now, of course, we have to do that journey again with our auto product, and as we roll out new products, we're going to have to continue to iterate. But that's probably the most illustrative example of like really working side by side
Mm.
and figuring something out.
There's two really interesting elements of that story I want to dig into because I think they're,
Mhm.
lessons people need to figure out how to apply in their own business. And one is the the data that you started with, the idea that the operations team was really looking at the core at a deep set of analytics around the drop off by document request, which I bet is a statistic that many people haven't actually looked at. So uh, I want to dig into that one first. And the second one, so you can start thinking about this one too, is this sense of iteration. I mean, you talked about having like, hey, you've uploaded the wrong document information in the product first before you got to, wait, why are we asking you to upload a document? So it seems like there's both a deep looking at data to help inform the direction you're going, and then a, I think, first principles, but paired with rapid iteration through like, hey, we're going to do something and we're going to learn something new and we're going to like do something else approach that I think is quite different than what often an operations team does, which is to kind of scale the support that's being provided. So can you talk a little bit about how you think about providing the infrastructure and approach to making data at the center of that, and then how iteration in that way kind of leads the path to where you're getting?
Yeah, I think those are great questions. And what I would say is there's a couple of components there. So on the data side, what I learned at Google is it's not even just about the data, it's about getting product engineering and ML to care about the problem and the user. There's this famous quote that we used to refer to, which was Henry Ford, and it was, if I had asked my customers what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse. So in the case with these documents and other things, I think what we were doing, and I'm going back many years now, is we were analyzing the data that was at our fingertips, which was these are the number of documents, this is how much delay there is because of documents, and it wasn't actually the operations team that figured out the connection with the 15% drop off. It was that we made our machine learning team really care about this problem, and as they obviously have much better capability and much better visibility into the fine grained data, and they were the ones who uncovered that statistic, and like the magic was in the sort of human version of the story and then the ML, the application. That said, generally, as a rule, you should have a practice of measuring everything you can in your product, both on the operation side and on the product side. And at Upstart, we have a value around being, one of our values is make clever use of numbers. So we're probably on the extreme end of whenever we're trying to understand a problem, we try to get very, very precise about the numbers. Like, which exact number am I trying to influence? Is it the speed to funding? Is it the drop off? Is it the conversion? Like, what is it? So we just have a habit of spending a lot of time on understanding the problem and the metric you're trying to move. So our systems are fairly well set up for that. But that said, all of that work doesn't need to happen in operations. You do have to have like an analytically minded, like business savvy operations team to drive the conversation. But I think the magic is in the kind of the flywheel of product engineering, machine learning, operations all working together to find these opportunities.
How do you, so now you got me a third area, which is like, how do you make that magic happen? Like, how do you get a machine learning or an engineering or a product team to really care about an operations team experience? And I think that's not only just at an emotional level, but at a career, and like, I feel like so many product teams are incented to ship shiny new objects and not to solve back end problems. And so how do you actually get a team to care about solving these kinds of problems? Feels like a non-trivial challenge for most organizations.
I would say one fine point there is our operational improvements are almost never about operational efficiency, meaning like the efficiency of the operations team. So we don't
Hmm.
start with the okay, we're processing these applications, how do we do that faster? And we
Hmm.
have obviously like done some improvements to our own internal
Hmm.
tools, but that's like a good idea, but not a great idea. The great idea is like, how do I make this process better for the user, like the end
Hmm.
user? And the sort of byproduct of that is it makes life and operations easier also, but that's not the starting point. And actually, particularly at Upstart, it's quite easy to get people to care about the end user because we tend to attract a more kind of mission
Hmm.
oriented crowd that kind of intuitively gets that like access to credit is access to opportunity. So I think it's a minor point, but a really important one. Getting somebody to care about the efficiency of like someone going through a manual process is one thing,
Hmm.
but getting someone to care about, you know, the success of their product, like the ability of
Hmm.
users to get access to it, like you can have the best loan in the world if people can't get through your process, it doesn't really matter, right? So I think that's a really important component of it. And then the other important component, I mean, early days, it was really easy to build relationships between the different functions because we are all like in the same shoebox of a room. So it
Hmm.
was like, hey, product, what do you think about this? I have this problem. As you scale, that gets a little bit harder to do, of course. But I think being intentional about building relationships between those teams. So, for example, we have like a Slack channel with product and engineering, and now not everybody in operations, sorry, is able to post to that product. There's like a smaller group that
Yeah, yeah.
is kind of live talking on that. We have product like operations verticals that work with the different product teams when we go to launch new products so they can be part of the conversation and the design and like really thinking hard about the user experience from day one so that those relationships are there. We do hackathons about once a year, so during those
Hmm.
times it's an opportunity for teams to come together. So I think you have to, in order to have a true like tech quality operations team, you have to burst the like bubble around engineering and product, but like not so much that it becomes disruptive for them. So you have to find a way to build those relationships and make those conversations happen.
I want to ask you one more question in this space, and I do want to get onto the HR part of what you do because I think that's another interesting part of the story. But as the group has grown in operations, you talked about the tension between not everybody can like call the product manager, but at the same time, I think you want to continue to encourage people to feel like, I feel I kind of reminded the old Toyota management system for our Toyota production system where anybody could pull the chain and stop the production line. Even a even a first year credit analyst who doesn't have a lot of experience can say, hey, this process is broken, we need to fix it. How do you encourage a culture where that's true, where I feel like it's often intimidating, particularly in a larger organization that's been around for a while, to go, hey, these guys know what they're doing, I must just be crazy to think this is wrong, I'm not going to raise my hand because it's going to show that I don't understand the problem well, as opposed to saying, hey, I'm going to raise my hand because I think there's a better way to do it. How do you keep that as the company grows, that kind of incentive and willingness of even junior employees who are on the front lines to raise those issues so you can try and resolve them or make the product better?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and there's no perfect answer. And one thing we tend to do, and it was funny because I was having this conversation with someone yesterday, and they were like, "I just had the same conversation with Jeff." So I think you have this conversation also, which is when new people start, we have this like
Ah,
the
yeah.
phrase I use is, "Don't be afraid to call my baby ugly." Everything at Upstart is a work in progress. And by the way, what you have right now is the value of fresh perspective. And in a little
Yeah.
while, that's going to wear off, and you're not going to see all the things that we should be doing better, different, etc. So we definitely try to build that into our kind of onboarding process and the conversations that managers are having when people start. Then the other component of it is like, of course, you have to do stuff. Like you have to actually do something with the feedback, and then you have to celebrate it when it happens. So that's how you kind of encourage that again flywheel effect of people seeing their rewards. And we definitely try to celebrate, when there's like really good breakthroughs between like on the product and engineering side that really impact our users. We celebrate it at TGIF. We post about it in the Kudos channel. We try to really um, reward people for doing this kind of work.
Recognize and reward for that kind of behavior.
Yeah.
So I forgot, we did forget my second original point, which is that this kind of value of iterating
Yeah.
through
Yeah.
changes, kind of like, do you view that as a weakness? Because there's a perspective I could take, which is like, hey, you had to iterate through it because you just didn't spend enough time figuring out the right answer up front. And now you screwed it up. And so, yeah, you fixed it 10 times. That's because you just like, it's like my kid brings me my homework and I got to fix it 10 times. It's like, you were supposed to
Yeah.
get it right the first time, big guy.
Yeah.
Um, do you view it that way, or is the iteration from point A through a bunch of series to point C more of a feature than a bug?
I'd say absolutely more a feature than a bug. In fact, sort of back to this values, like our first value is like make every second count. And we really try to
Mm,
be a default go versus default wait company.
mm,
And what we find is you are going to learn more when you get the product out in front of users than you
mm,
will in any kind of whiteboarding session where you're trying to. So, of course, you're in a financial services industry, there's a lot of regulations, you're a bank partner platform. So, of course, you can't be irresponsible about these things. But this
mhm,
idea of like launch and iterate just because it doesn't work yet doesn't mean it won't work. That's very much part of the kind of upstart culture and experience. And I think when we turn to HR, we'll probably talk more about how
yeah.
I think there's the advantage that startups have is being able to move quickly and iterate. And like now the name of the game is like, how do you do that as a bigger company? But so
Mm.
far, speed is like definitely a feature and definitely something that we work really hard to protect and encourage. And that
And it
means
feels like you also
iterating.
then have to build your systems to iterate rapidly to say, hey, we're not going to do a 5 year release cycle or a 3 year release cycle, and we're going to figure out. You've got to be ready for, hey, we're going to figure stuff out along the way, and then we got to be ready to like,
Yeah,
adopt those learnings in a pretty rapid fashion.
yeah. And I think we're in a like daily release cycle now, right? Like maybe getting to like a
Yeah,
couple times a day. Like that's
couple times a day
yeah.
sometimes if you can do that. So it's yeah, but that's the kind of, yeah, the flip side of that is, are you engineering the systems, both processes and technically, for
Mhm.
like adapting to learnings on the fly?
Yeah.
All right, so let's switch hats a little bit because you run the operations show here, but also I think Dave sometimes calls you the heart and soul of the company. You run the kind of people operations, where Paul and Dave tend to fall more on the purely analytical and maybe forget some of the, it's not as natural to them to go into the people side of the equation, where I think that's kind of where we rely on you a lot. Um, Talk to me a little bit about, well, I guess the most obvious question for so many people is like, hey, we went to pandemic and went
Mhm.
to pure remote work. We were a pretty in-person culture
Mhm.
pre-pandemic. Where are you landing on what the future of that kind of dynamic looks like in terms of where and how people will be coming into an office in the future?
Yeah. It's a great question, and gosh, what a difference a couple of years makes on that front. But
Yeah.
yeah, so Upstart approach to back to office is this model that we sort of invented, which is called digital first. And the idea is you can live or work anywhere in the United States. However, we want you to have in-person collaboration with your teammates. So on a cadence of about once per month, more for some teams, less for others, you're encouraged to come to one of our three offices and
Hmm.
have do in-person collaboration stuff. And we pay for all of your expenses to do that. So it's really um, kind of open-ended. And the idea there was to really maximize for two things. One is flexibility. It became very, very
Hmm.
obvious that what people really want from this like at-home remote experience is flexibility. It's not necessarily that people only want to work out of their bedroom, but this idea of like driving to the office and spending 3 hours in traffic, like
Yeah.
that died somewhere during one of the variants. I feel like around Delta-ish. I feel like that idea kind of died. However, in-office collaboration is so important for so many reasons, like
Mm.
the kind of relationships that you can build face to face, the kind of problem solving you can do, like the serendipitous interactions, like all that stuff is really, really, really important to the underlying fabric of how a company works. And and we didn't want to lose that. And we felt like people actually didn't really want to lose that. So this model we landed is really aspiring to solve for the best of both worlds. You have all the flexibility. However, you also have these in-person interactions, and some of them will be highly scripted. So there'll be, traditional offsites where, you have a deck and you're trying to solve a problem. And some of them are going to be like you're just in the office, like working near your coworkers, and you all
Mm.
go out to dinner that evening or something like this. It's going to be kind of a variety of different models. But our hope is, this allows us to recruit the best talent from anywhere. And our prior is
Mm.
the best talent is going to have a choice. So um, and but at the same time protect, we think like a couple of days in the office done right can get you most of the benefit that you get from an in-office experience without dealing with kind of all the other constraints. So that's our digital
Mm.
first approach.
That's the digital first approach. Um, I want to ask you two things about that. I mean, I think it's pretty early days. Like the continued wave of variants seems to have held off the actual
Mm-hmm.
implementation. Although we recently did have the exec staff on site for an in-person day or two, which was
And
like,
didn't it feel so good?
felt so
Felt
good to
so
be back.
good.
And I
Yeah.
was coming fresh off of a conference where I saw a bunch of bankers in person and went,
Yeah.
man, this is people. Like it's you forget how much you miss it.
Mhm.
Um, but how do you think about what changes in the dynamic, the way people communicate? So much of what happens in an office is like water cooler and informal channels of communication. And obviously that breaks down if you're there a couple days a month. You don't have those anymore. How are you thinking about how you try and build the right pathways and communication styles or protocols or habits for people when they're trying to maintain a culture over a remote working environment?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I don't have a perfect answer for it. Our hope is that what happens is you build these relationships and kind of these deeper and personal interactions. They tend to be a combination of work and fun. So you're like kind of trying to accelerate
Mhm.
both like the trust aspect and the collaboration aspect. And then when you're remote, we of course use like all the Google collaboration tools, all of the,
Mhm.
we use Zoom, of course, just like everyone else. We are a very heavy Slack culture, which I have found does a pretty good job getting pretty close to water cooler conversation because it somehow it just drops the overhead of like an email like feels like such a formal interaction versus to fire off a Slack is a lot easier. So we
Mhm.
use that really extensively. And kind of early in the pandemic, we were doing a lot of like, in-person virtual events and happy hours. And we of course have our standing company TGIF meeting where we all get together and
Mhm.
kind of answer questions and give updates. So there are a few touch points. I have to say, it feels to me like people have such fatigue over Zoom events that like that trend is going to be like people are just not going to want to drink wine over Zoom with each other for that much longer. They're going to
Yeah.
prefer to do that in person. But those are a few of the irons we have in the fire. And what's been kind of remarkable to me is when we went into the pandemic, Upstart was maybe 400 people, and now we're like north of 1,500 or so. And during that time, so the vast majority of people, haven't worked together in an office. Yet our
It's
like
crazy.
culture amp results, which is the way that we measure engagements, have just gone up and up during this time. So somehow
Hmm.
between the Slacks and the meetings in person, it's working and people are holding those relationships together. But I'm really, really excited to see as these on-sites happen, how much stronger we become as a company.
And lastly, just leaving aside the kind of digital nature and the shifting concept of work, I mean, going from 400 or, when I joined four to what is the company size now? It's like
Think as of
1500
last
or
public notice, it was 1,500-ish. It's bigger now.
I won't ask you to make any non-public
Yeah, let's
announcements,
not make
but
any
that's
not
a
public
really
announcements, but yeah.
that's a massive rate
Yeah.
of growth. I mean, 400 to something like 1500 during the last 2 years of the pandemic is kind of a crazy rate of growth. What are lessons learned or things you've found to help maintain a culture as you grow through that? I mean, whether you're in person or
Hmm.
digital, it's still like a massive amount of growth, and you have the opportunity for the culture to really shift. And I'm curious what you found as effective ways to kind of manage through that transition and that growth. 'Cause it's kind of an astounding thing when you think about how many new people have joined the company in the last 2 years.
Yeah. Um, so I get this question in interviews a lot, and the biggest thing I point to is our values. I know it sounds so trite, but you were there when we were like 24 people. I made everybody sit in
I
a
was.
room and like talk about who we are and who are we not, who are we the right fit for and who are we not. And we revisited those values like every couple of years since then, and they've largely remained unchanged. And we've wordsmithed like every word of those things. We're very precision
Hmm.
oriented culture, right? And so I think what's been really helpful is to try to attract people for whom those values kind of naturally resonate. So,
Hmm.
every second counts. Like we look for people who want to be in a fast-paced environment, who want to grow. Like if you're, you know, uh, if work-life balance is really important to you, if you want to um, have a job versus a career, Upstart's probably not the right place for you because we're really fast paced. It's always up and to the right. However, if you want to learn, grow, have an impact, we're probably, a better fit. Not to say we don't have like work life balance. I think we actually do a pretty good job on that, but that shouldn't be the
Hmm.
primary motivation if we care. We actually we have a value around be smart, but know that you might be wrong. And that was a nod to there are a lot of brilliant jerks in Silicon Valley, and we're not trying to hire them here. We want people that are going to learn from each other, grow, etc. So I won't go through the whole list, but we were extremely precise in how to define like who is Upstart the right culture for. And then when we interview and we screen people, we really try to bring in people that are going to thrive here, and
Hmm.
be really transparent about who we are and who we're not. So I think that's been a really important continuum because we've had to scale so rapidly. You know, there was a day where Dave Paul and I interviewed like every single hire, like those days are long gone. So I think the continuity and the cultural thread has been a lot about getting kind of like-minded people to
Mm,
work on these problems. And then we try to be really transparent as a company. Like back before we were a public company, we do this every Friday meeting where teams present on various cool launches and things, but then the
mhm,
founders host a Q&A and you can ask us any question on any topic. I found that to be a really healthy practice at Google. Um,
mhm,
we back before we were public, we used to actually do monthly presentations of like all of the numbers we presented to the board. We'd present to the whole company and like answer all the questions about the good, bad, and the ugly, like all the things. We can't do that anymore as a public company, but we do that meeting right after we do our earnings announcement in the window that we have. And I think
mhm,
like people think that Google culture is about like the puppies and the yummy food and the whatever, but it's actually, to me, it wasn't about that. It was about making sure that like everyone at Google connected with their mission, and was like rowing in the same direction, excited to find problems that they wanted to fix, had
mhm.
like took on ownership for the kind of company they tried to build. And I think those things have kind of been really nicely imported to Upstart, where it's very, you get like-minded people
Mhm.
who really believe in this mission, who have a certain cadence of work, and it just kind of continues to scale nicely that way.
I think that concept of like hiring to maintain the culture, I don't, that's maybe the wrong way to describe it, but that the way you maintain the culture is hiring the people who agree with the approach, I think is a really fascinating one, as opposed to trying to like teach everybody a different way of thinking or
Yeah.
approaching
Well,
things.
and
It's a
something we say
fascinating
to
take.
people when they join is like culture. One of the things that I think is really important is to have an ownership culture. So if you see something you don't like at
Mm,
Upstart, like you go fix it. And this concept of like culture isn't something that's manufactured by your HR team. And actually, as founders, you can't like wish a culture upon an organization. Like the culture is your people. And those people are either like uplifting your culture or they're not. And by the way,
mm,
inertia is going to pull you in the other direction. So, like, as you get bigger,
mm.
naturally you're going to get slower. You need people inside your organization to like kick and scream when that happens and force change. And I get to be on the receiving end of some of that kicking and screaming, and like I love it. I really, really appreciate it, because that's how you kind of perpetuate the culture that you aspire to have.
So I'm gonna ask you one more question. I don't know if you're prepared for, it, but I feel like Upstart imported a lot of practices
Yeah.
from Google. I actually think that in many ways, Google is the cultural grandfather or
Hmm.
godfather of many Silicon Valley companies. That more than most of the other large tech companies, they've kind of exported their cultural practices and DNA, even the words, things like PERF for
Hmm.
performance reviews and OKRs. I feel like they're kind of the one whose cultural practices have been most widely adopted. And obviously, with a lot of ex Google on our founding team, that's true here too. So I want to ask you the
Hmm.
inverse, which is like, are there things you consciously wanted to not bring or lessons to learn in the negative from the experiences at Google? Not that I want to bash Google, but like things you said, hey, here's something that we saw that we feel like we can do better in the context of Upstart as we're building from scratch again, versus the things you just brought over because they were working well.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And I would say the biggest element like that was speed. So a lot of us early upstarters, which there's a good number, including yourself, experienced Google at their like really kind of fast execution
Fast ramp.
phase, but started to
Yeah.
see some of the problems that come from scale. And I think we were really deliberate about like actively watching out for that and like building a company that was going to somehow like resist getting slower as they got bigger.
Mm,
And in the early days, what that meant is like making sure your decision making is fast, not having like committees that slow things down, not feeling like you have to have the perfect answer, kind of like all those things. Right now, we're trying to hack like, okay, what can we do differently now as we scale during this next phase? And our kind of a little creative solution here, which I didn't see at Google, is we broke up the company into around 10-ish vertical teams. And they're interesting because they're not all
mhm,
product verticals. They're basically a summary of our like important priorities as a company. So some of them are verticals like auto or personal loans, and some of them are operational scalability or machine learning advantage. They're just kind of company priorities of teams that work together. And the idea is, can you basically create many small startups within Upstart that can operate almost independently with their own leadership team, their own resources, their own roadmaps, and like, can we keep sprinting at the speed of a startup as we operate this bigger public company? And that was probably in a lot of ways informed by some of our PTSD around experiencing Google so fast and then feeling it kind of start to slow down as it got to scale.
Well, and as I remember it too, part of this came, I think, conjoined with the experience of the on-sites and the 3 days a month, because it was kind of like, who do you need? You don't need just a functional team in the office, because most of our teams are cross-functional, and you need the right cross-functional people there at the same time to get this. And so we kind of went, well, that's like, it's like a vertical team that's doing stuff. And we kind of like said, hey, maybe we should think about organizing more consciously around those projects that have legal and compliance and growth and product and engineering and sales, but they're working on the same problem. And that's, I think it's also much like the digital first initiative Upstart. It's quite different than I think how most companies are organized, in a pretty different approach, but a quite interesting one.
Yeah, we have this saying at Upstart where statements like, we can't do this because nobody else does it this way, or we have to do it this way because everybody else does it that way, aren't good answers to any questions at Upstart. You should really start with like, if I had a white sheet of paper, how would I do it? And so some of this digital first meets vertical teams is really our like first principles approach to scaling Upstart for the next, 5 to 10 years, 3 to 5 years. I don't know.
Well, I guess
5 to 10 seems like a really long time. Let's call it 3 to 5.
It's only been 10. I'll have to bring you back in 3 to 5 and see how vertical teams and digital first is going. So it feels like they're both pretty early in their life cycle, but pretty bold departures from what I think the common wisdom in, either financial services or technology is about how you organize companies, or how you kind of, I think companies in the digital, like either 3 days a week or remote, and there's not this kind of interesting different structure. So I'll be very curious to see how they play out.
Yeah.
Optimistic.
Yeah, cautiously optimistic. And it'll be a work in progress. So you can call this baby ugly, and
we'll iterate rapidly
and it'll get better.
Answer.
Yeah.
That's right. And we'll record a new podcast and tell people where it goes.
Yeah.
And I have the same 3 closing questions I ask everybody in the podcast. So I'm going to throw them at you now and just get your quick takes. One, what is the best piece of career advice you've ever gotten? You've had some great mentors. I know many of them. So I'm really curious what you're going to answer with here.
The one I like most is use every opportunity to prove how good you are, no matter how small.
Can you give me an example of what that means to you?
Yeah, I mean, one example is, so when I was at Google, I raised my hand for a project I had no business raising my hand for, which was basically creating a system for managing outages, which was like a big problem there. And
there's a lot of outages back in the day at Google.
Yeah, and so it's kind of a long story of how I got to own this problem for Google. But what it practically meant is for 2 years, I was on call for any product that broke down at Google ever. And I would be like the one, in the early days, I would be the one to like handwrite the email, like, okay, we're having an outage, here's what's going on. But through those emails, like a lot of people got to know me. We ended up building a really cool product. That's how I met Dave. And, that was the only interaction those people ever had with me. Like I never met our VP of engineering, but he would see Anna Mongate at the time, not Anna Counselman, answering these outage emails. And like he started to form an opinion about who I am, and, when I needed to switch teams, he was helpful or whatnot. So you never know like who's watching what you're doing or what next opportunities kind of come from the work that you're doing. But if you just use every opportunity to do the very best that you can, I believe in careers, good stuff will happen.
It sounds like the other half of that is to raise your hand.
Yes. Raise your hand before you're ready is number 2. That's I got that.
Feels like those are kind of
together. I got that from Sheryl Sandberg before she was like Sheryl Sandberg, where she was just the manager at Google, and it's a really great one.
Raise your hand before you're ready. I like it. All right, my second question: what's the best piece of advice about consumer banking or consumer lending you've gotten?
Figure out who's not going to pay you back and don't lend to them.
It's
pretty simple, but it's hard to do. But if you do that, like everything else gets better. Rates for everybody else get better. I know we haven't spent like a ton of time like making the perfect recovery process. Like just figure out who's not going to pay you back.
Yeah, I think it's an underinvested in area in lending, if that can be believed, because it
Yeah,
feels like the crux of it, but I feel
it's
like
the
more
crux of
companies are
it. But
built
yet, like,
around it.
how many companies are really iterating at the or innovating at the underwriting step?
Yeah,
Not that many, not as many as you think. Yeah.
yeah, I think that's true. And lastly, what's one bold prediction for the future? You've given
Yeah.
me a few today, but
I would say in 10 years, every financial institution is going to use machine learning and AI in their underwriting. It's just going to be the only way to do it, the one that makes the most sense, the one that results in the best outcomes for consumers. Um, and we're just getting started on that journey.
we are just getting started. I think it's a great place to end the conversation. Anna, thanks for taking the time and joining us today.
Of course. Thanks for having me.